to be recorded. So I don't think there's an announcement anymore about the recording, but I hope we are recording now. So hello and welcome everyone to this Adobe Analytics user group meeting. I'm Frederick and I'm the lead of the user group, and sorry for the last minute link change. So anyone who's been waiting on the on a different call just a minute ago, we had to switch some things around last minute. So while people are still coming in, I'm going to start with your official introductions. So, hello, I'm Frederick. I'm the user group lead for the EMEA user group, and today we're going to have a very special guest, my fellow Adobe champion, Andrew, who's going to go into the topic of Web SDK and how to navigate the Web SDK jungle and all the elephants and banana peels that are going to cross your way while doing that. While people are still coming in, let me welcome you to this user group meeting from the official Adobe Analytics user group. I'm from Acutix, a company that is a Adobe software partner, and we make solutions that work really nicely with Adobe Analytics. So what we generally want to achieve with the Adobe Analytics user group is to help people create more value with Adobe Analytics, bring them together, help them to find a platform to share their content and their experiences just as we do today. And yeah, also offer a platform for networking. So we do a quarterly meeting virtually. We're also going to do some meetings in person this year, which I'm very excited for. And yeah, just have fun together around our favorite topic of Adobe Analytics. What I want you to be sure of is that you're also part of the user group chapter. So you can actually sign up for those events without being part of the chapter, but you can become one of the cool 602 people right now who are part of the chapter by clicking this join button on the user group page, which will then also alert you of any future events. So if you want to join any of the, so many people that I have to admit, sorry about that. If you want to join any of the future in-person events, if you want to be notified of the quarterly calls and all that, please make sure to join the chapter as well. And also, if you want to catch up on all the good content later on, not just from this user group, but also all of the other user groups across the globe, make sure to also subscribe to the Adobe Analytics user group's YouTube channel and become maybe the 700th subscriber. There's like literally dozens of hours of content on there already. And there's going to be so much more this meeting as well. And yeah, we would love to have you as part of that YouTube channel and the user group. And with that, without much further ado, over to Andrew and the actual topic of today.
Hello. Yes, thank you, Frederick. Let me just share my screen.
Yes. All right, you can share your screen. That's amazing.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Okay, yeah, so just before we get into the agenda, I suppose just a little bit of background about me and why I'm here. So I'm a digital analytics manager with over 15 years experience. I've seen a lot of change in the industry over that period of time. I think Web SDK is definitely one of those things. And really the reason I'm here to speak to you today is because of the fantastic work we've been doing at Nationwide, migrating over our implementation to Web SDK. So we've been on that journey for about a year. And over the course of that time, we've migrated around 20 or more website platforms across to Web SDK. And we've really learned a lot of things along that journey. And so today's session is really about trying to share some of those insights with everyone to try and give you a bit of a leg up and try and help you on your own Web SDK journey. So from an agenda point of view, I've got a few things that I want to cover today. First of all, I'm going to give you my reasons why we've moved to Web SDK. Then we're going to have a bit of a look at some of the key differences that Web SDK brings versus previous sort of implementation approaches for Adobe Analytics. I'm going to do a quick demo of how to set things up to try and help orientate people and give people an idea of where they're going in the tool. Then we're going to talk about some of the specific challenges that Adobe Analytics can pose. And finally, I've got some common implementation mistakes that we've made along the way. And hopefully, if I share them with everyone, you won't have to make those same mistakes. Okay, so let's get straight into it. Why move to Web SDK? So I had really 4 reasons why we've moved across to Web SDK.
Sorry, Andrew. It seems like your screen sharing just disappeared, at least for me.
Oh, okay. Let me see if I can reshare.
Yeah, sorry about that.
It says only meeting organizers and presenters can share. It's kicked me out somehow.
Well, so let's see. That's a setting I can change.
Oh, there we go. It's back.
All right. Whatever that was, I blame Microsoft. Sorry about that.
No, that's quite all right. That's quite all right. Let me just restart the old presentation. Okay, so why move to Web SDK? So I had 4 reasons why we've moved to Web SDK. These are my reasons. Adobe may put forward others. You might have your own, but these were the things that were really important to us. So the first thing was support for first-party ID. So certain browsers, certain companies, shall we say fruit-based companies, quite like to limit the lifetime of cookies. So you may set your cookies to last a year or 2 years, but in reality, on certain browsers, those cookies may be considerably limited, maybe 7 days or less, depending upon how they are treated. One of the things that Web SDK supports is first-party IDs. And with that, we can overcome and extend the lifetime of those cookies, getting back to something more reasonable, say a year. And for us, that's really important because data quality is really important to us. So obviously, the impact of having a reduced lifespan on those cookies is more first-time visitors. We're less able to understand the lifetime of a customer on our website. If we can get those cookies to extend out again, then we get all that insight back again. So that was a really important reason for us. The next one is performance. So all the different JavaScript files that you have to put into the page at the moment to support your various different Adobe products and other products, they're not as quick as Web SDK. So Web SDK provides a smaller JavaScript file, a faster JavaScript file, so you can get some performance benefits out of putting Web SDK in. The next thing is real-time data. So Web SDK uses Adobe's latest infrastructure. And one of the things that's included in that is the Edge network. And with the Edge network, we can be forwarding data onto various different systems, either Adobe or other systems in near real time. So that was really important to us. And the final thing I would say is it's an important thing for us to be on Web SDK because we think this is where Adobe is likely to be investing most of their time and effort. So for instance, first-party ID support, you don't get that if you're using app measurement and visitor ID service and things like that. So Web SDK is likely to be the future for Adobe, certainly for the coming years, and therefore that's where we're most likely to see new features and new innovations. So definitely worth thinking about getting onto the Web SDK so you can take advantage of those different things. So now I'm going to have a bit of a look at some of the key differences between Web SDK and previous implementation approaches. So I've got 4 different things to go through. The first of which is getting our heads around the idea that this is a one-to-many system rather than point-to-point. So with current implementations, you may be used to putting a JavaScript tag in for Adobe Analytics, and that sends data to your Adobe Analytics infrastructure. You put another tag in for Adobe Target, and that communicates to the Adobe Target infrastructure, and so on and so forth. When we introduce Web SDK into the equation, we're actually replacing all of those different JavaScript tags and that kind of all those different collection servers with a single JavaScript tag and a single edge network collection server. That edge network then is able to distribute the data that's collected between those different platforms. So supporting obviously Adobe's newer platforms such as their CDP, AJO, CJA, etc., but also their other existing capabilities such as Adobe Analytics and Adobe Target. And you can even use this infrastructure to forward data onto third-party capabilities as well, or your own internal systems. So with that comes a bit of a change in the way in which we treat data. So you may be used to, with Adobe Analytics, having an S object in the page. With Web SDK, all of the data and variables that you'll be setting are really based around this XDM object that goes with Web SDK. So there are some kind of key differences there. So when we're talking about Adobe Analytics, we're doing, and the S object, all of the data that we're setting in there is really specifically done for Adobe Analytics. Whereas the XDM object, as we've just seen from the last diagram, is actually acting as a source for multiple different solutions. This theme sort of continues. So with Adobe Analytics, again, if you're thinking about the format in which you're setting those variables, things like the product variable or list vars or these different kind of things, they're all very specific to Adobe Analytics, and they're in a format that Adobe Analytics wants. But actually, if we ever export data out of Adobe Analytics, it can be quite difficult for other systems to interpret that. You have to build logic to unpick what's going on. With XDM, the XDM object is actually a JSON, so is JSON based. So it's a much more generic format, which is potentially easier for other systems to consume. And finally, the S object is pretty rigid in its structure. It's there, again, to support Adobe Analytics. It has a very kind of specific format to it. Whereas your XDM object, there's lots of opportunities to customize that for your own purposes and your own scenarios. So the third difference is we are now dealing with the edge network. Now, whereas previously you had a JavaScript tag and that communicated with your Adobe Analytics server, we now have our Web SDK tag, and smack bang in the middle between the JavaScript tag and Adobe Analytics, we have the edge network. And that's a new thing if you've never done Web SDK before. The idea that there is a bunch of kind of server-side stuff that you have to do in order to enable data to flow through the system. And there are really two key things that you have to configure on the edge network to get things up and running. Firstly, you have to define what that XDM object is going to look like, and you do that through a schema. So this basically determines what variables are available for you to send in via your Web SDK. The second thing you have to configure is where the data that's received by the edge network gets sent to. So that is done through a data stream, and you can select Adobe Analytics and other destinations from that. So finally, just going to have a little bit of a comparison of client-side setup, old world versus the new world with Web SDK. So as mentioned, when we're talking about the tags that we're adding, just to support something like Analytics and Target, you may have 3 or 4 different libraries that you're deploying, whereas with Web SDK, you've got the one Web SDK extension. Client-side variables, again, we've talked about this. We've got the S object for Analytics in the old world, and now we're using this more generic XDM object. And then another key difference is how we transmit data back to Adobe. So with the old world app measurement and analytics, we're used to using two different functions to determine whether it's a page view or a custom link tracking call. So we've got s.t for a page view and s.tl for custom link tracking. A bit of a change with Web SDK. We have a single send event function that we use, and it's actually the variables that are contained within the XDM object which determine whether you are doing a page view or whether you are doing custom link tracking. So I think at this point it's a good idea to just go and have a little bit of a look in the tool, and we can just have a little bit of a look at how the edge network config is done, and how one would set up to do a simple page view in Adobe Launch. And I guess my motivation for doing this is really just to help you orientate yourself in terms of the different areas of the tool that you're going to be going into and how that looks. Okay, so here all I've done is log into the Experience platform and go to data collection. I've come over to the schemas area here. So if you remember, what the schema is going to do is it's going to determine what variables that we can use within Web SDK. It basically determines what data the edge network is expecting to receive when we're sending stuff in. The one thing that I would say just before I even start the schemas is one thing you may not have come across before if you're purely doing Adobe Analytics is the concept of sandboxes. So with Adobe's new products, a new way of sort of governing and organizing those products is to arrange them in sandboxes. So you could have sandboxes for production and dev, or you might have different sandboxes for different regions that are managed across the globe, or so on and so forth. So it's a way of collecting things together and applying a sort of layer of governance. With Adobe Analytics, I don't think you actually, if you're just doing Adobe Analytics, you're probably not going to have to worry about that too much. But you do need to know which sandbox you are in order to do some of the config. So this here, if you look at this, when you're in here, this is the name of the sandbox that you are currently in. I'm in a dev one at the moment. You can go in and you can select a live one, but you need to make a note of this so that you can complete the configuration within the Web SDK. So we're going to create a basic schema now that we can use to transmit data. I'm just going to go and click the Create Schema button. So when we're sending a web data in, the only one of these that you're ever going to select is the experience events one. So this is really about sort of event-based data, such as people viewing pages, clicking buttons, and so on and so forth. We need to enter a name, so we can do something like schema demo. You can add an optional description. And when we create it, it will have a sort of basic set of variables that are included. But we will need to add to that in order to get this working with Adobe Analytics. So we have now created our schema. Now, there are different ways you can add to this, but Adobe actually provide a whole range of sort of pre-canned field groups that you can add to this. And there's one that is very useful to us, which is Adobe Analytics based one. So if you search for Adobe Analytics, we have the Adobe Analytics Experience Event template. So I can select that and add those field groups. And it takes a moment to refresh, but what will happen is you'll see those appear in this list. There we go. So we've actually added a whole load of extra stuff in here, and there's a couple of areas that I'll just point out as being particularly important to us. first of all, there is this web object. And within this web object, we've got stuff. This is where we set things like page names. It's where we set those variables that I talked about, which determine whether you're doing a page view or doing link tracking. And the other bit, which I'll talk about a little bit later, is this underscore experience part of the object. And there is some stuff in here under analytics that will look very familiar to you. So things like props, evars, list vars, events, etc., etc. So there's some stuff in there that's worth knowing about. Okay, so by just coming in here, clicking through those few different steps and adding this field group, we basically have a schema that we can now use for our data collection. I'm just going to save that. So once that's saved, what we then need to go and configure is the data stream. And as we talked about, that data stream is where we're going to determine what capabilities we're going to be forwarding data on to that is received by the edge network. So coming over to data streams, I'm going to create a new data stream and we're going to enter in a name. And here's where we select the schema that we just created. And I'm just going to save that. So we've created a data stream. We've associated our schema with that data stream. We now need to add some services. So this is where we can go and select Adobe Analytics. And we also, at this point, determine where we're going to send data to. So I'm going to use our dev server for this, our dev report suite. So there are a couple of different ways. So one of your questions may be, how do I send things to dev? How do I send things to live in terms of report suites? There are a few ways to do this. The way we've done it is simply to set up different data streams for those different areas. Adobe have actually introduced the ability to do overrides and sort of override which thing you're using. Personally, I am sticking with just setting up separate data streams because I think it gives you just a little bit more control over where things are going. But you may want to also look at those override capabilities. I'm just going to save that off. Okay, so we have now actually completed all of the steps we need in order to be able to use the edge network. We have something set up. So something set up that's expecting to receive a bunch of variables and then send those variables on to Adobe Analytics. So I'm now going to go over to tags, and we're just going to do a quick setup in tags of a simple page view right from installing the extension. So we're going to go and put the Web SDK extension in from the catalog. We're going to install that. And there's a little bit of config that we have to do in the Web SDK extension to get up and running. A lot of your stuff will be pre-populated. But this is then where we configure our data stream stuff. So we are going to select, if you remember, I said we need the sandbox in order to be able to do the config. So we're going to select the sandbox that we made a note of earlier. And obviously, you'd probably set these up differently for the different environments, but just so I can demo this and get it up and running, I'm just going to select the exact same options for all three. There we go. There's not a lot else in here that just to get something up and running, you're going to have to play with. Obviously, you need to read through these and understand them. There are various different things that you can configure. One section just to call out, because I'm going to talk about it later, is this enabled click data collection. There are a few quirks with that section, so we'll come on to that and cover that a little bit later. Okay, so that should be enough, in fact, to be able to do the demo. So I'm now going to configure some basic data elements that we need in order to do a page view. So as per your existing implementation, you may have a data element that grabs your page name from your data layer. And that will probably be relatively familiar to you if you are using data collection tags. The slightly newer thing that you may not be so familiar with is using the Web SDK extension. So this is where we can create our XDM object. So we'll call this page XDM object. So again, we need to select our sandbox and we need to select our schema. Okay, so you may recognize this. This is the same tree that I was showing you that we'd set up. This is basically the schema that we set up on the Edge network. These are all the same things. You can see the underscore experience part of the object, which I pointed out earlier, and the web part of the object, which I pointed out earlier. So here is where we actually go and configure some stuff. So we are going to do a page view. So to do that, we need to populate part of this web page details section. If we were doing a link tracking call, we'd actually need to be populating some stuff in here. So to do a page view, we need to set this to a 1 so that we're counting a page view. And we need to populate the name field with our page name. So similar to other parts of the wizard that you're probably familiar with, you can go and select data elements. So we're going to dynamically populate the page name with that. And populating this field in the XDM object auto maps across to the page name field in Adobe Analytics. So there's no, so assuming we transmit this XDM object back to the Edge network, that'll automatically get forwarded to Adobe Analytics and the page name field will get populated. So we can save that. And then within rules, we're going to create one for a page view. So we could we could perhaps have a, let's say there was an event like that in our page, which is going to be our page views. And what we are then going to do is use the Web SDK extension to send that data using the send event. So we're going to select page views because we're doing page views. If I was doing link clicks, I'd select that. There are some ones in here for target as well, I'll just mention, which you may need to select if you are sending stuff to target. And we're going to select our XDM object. And then pretty much everything else I think we can leave as default. Okay, so that is it. Basically, we have gone through the end-to-end process of setting up a basic page view. And really everything else that you are likely to do is going to build on this as the foundation. So, having done a little bit of a demo of the basic way in which we get stuff set up, it's time to get into some of the more nitty-gritty. So, there are some specific challenges with Adobe Analytics, and I guess we should face that head on. The elephant in the room really is the fact that Adobe didn't design Web SDK for Adobe Analytics. It was done as a sort of next generation product, supporting Adobe's Experience Cloud products, so things like CGA, AJO, real-time CDP. And therefore, there are some compromises or some decisions that we have to make about how we get this to work with Adobe Analytics. So probably our biggest challenge is this one. So it's joining old and new together. So what we have is Web SDK coming along with a shiny new XDM object, and Adobe Analytics is where's my props and evars? Basically, we've somehow got to join the old and the new together. What I would say at this point is I honestly don't think best practice really exists for this. And that's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, this is very much still evolving. So Adobe are still innovating, they're still listening to feedback, they're still bringing updates and new ways of doing things, which we'll get onto. But also, it's as much to do with the fact that everybody's implementation is probably very different. Therefore, what works for one may not work for another. So what I can do today is I can lay out the different options, and I can go through what I think are the pros and cons to those options, and I can give you a bit of insight into the decisions that we made and how we sort of fell on some of those things. So I think in terms of marrying the old and the new, you've really got three different ways of doing that. The first option, and this is a kind of evolution of Adobe's thinking. So the first option they came out with, and this was originally the only way you could do this, was to have a wonderful shiny new XDM object, which was completely generic and had nothing in it that was specific to Adobe Analytics. You would send that back to the Edge network, and there were a few things within there that would auto map, like page name, but by and large, you were on your own. It was going to take that nice JSON object, which might contain arrays and all that kind of stuff, and it would literally flatten it and turn them into context data variables and forward those context data variables onto Adobe Analytics, and then you would need to map them to your Adobe variables, your props and evars, using processing rules, and then your data would be available. Option two, so having listened to customer feedback, people wanted more ability to do stuff client side. So option two that they came out with is that experience object that I pointed out when we were looking at the XDM object. So that experience part of the object contains a number of things which are specific to Adobe Analytics. And if you populate those variables, then you will find that they get auto mapped. So you don't need, therefore, to use context data variables or processing rules. They will just go through and appear in Adobe Analytics. So you populate it client side, Edge network automatically forwards that on, and it ends up in Adobe for you. And then at the US Summit, Adobe have introduced option 3, which is very new, and there's not a lot of documentation out there on this yet. But this is potentially an even easier way of doing things. So it's very similar to option 2 in the fact that you populate some variables client side, and those variables get auto mapped over to Adobe Analytics. But the key difference is they've created a new part of their object, which actually sits outside of XDM. And that object will take variables in the format that you have them in already for Adobe Analytics. So a really good example would be something like the product string. So with option 2, if you want to transmit product and have it auto map, you actually have to completely deconstruct your product string. You have to put it into this new format, which is in an array. And then what happens is the edge network converts that back to the product string for you, and it ends up in Adobe Analytics. With option 3, you can literally take your product string, semicolons and all, drop it into a variable in that new data object, and it will auto map that into Adobe Analytics for you. Also, the way of populating that is a bit more wizard driven and more familiar, I would say, to somebody who is using Adobe Launch or Adobe Data Collection tags. It's definitely a much more familiar kind of pattern of using rules to populate things. Okay, so we're going to quickly run through some of the differences between these different options, some of the key differences. So the first thing for me when considering this stuff is the XDM object. So with the first option, what you are doing is potentially setting yourself up for the future more. So you are fully embracing the new XDM format and populating that in a way which would be useful to any solution consuming that XDM object. Option 2 kind of is a bit of a halfway house. So you are populating areas of the XDM object which are going to be useful to other solutions such as product and so on and so forth. But you are also, in order to make it a bit easier and to give you a bit more flexibility, you are also doing some stuff in that XDM object, which is Adobe Analytics specific. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have this new option, option 3. Basically, almost everything that you're chucking in to the object client side is going to be very Adobe Analytics focused. So when we're talking about the XDM object, we may then have to think about reformatting things to get it into the XDM object. Obviously, with option 1, you're going to be looking and basically touching almost every variable and having to work out how to format that into the XDM object. Props and evars with option 2 can be pretty much taken as is, because you can just go and map those into that new area, that underscore experienced area, but you are going to have to do quite a lot of refactoring of things like product list vars events because they are in a little bit of a different format. And option 3, you can just take everything as is. Mapping logic, and this is an important one. With option 1, you are basically limiting yourself to doing a lot of the logic to get things back into an Adobe Analytics acceptable format server side. So the issues with that are processing rules can be quite limiting. Personally, this is the reason why we didn't do option 1. We went with option 2. Option 3 wasn't available, but we went with option 2 just because I couldn't face having to use processing rules. It made me feel a little nauseous, the idea of having to deal with those. So option 2 and option 3, obviously, because you're doing stuff on the client, you've got the full extent of JavaScript available to you to do all of that. And then finally, migration difficulty. I think with option 1, you've got a lot to do, and you are having to use processing rules. So there's quite a high level of difficulty, I think, in getting all of that stuff set up. Option 2 is a medium sort of level. It's halfway between the two. You do have to do some work to refactor some of your stuff, but you are moving towards that future support of the XDM object. So it's medium. And the third option is obviously low, because you are just going to take everything that you did in Adobe Analytics and slam it into this new data object. I guess for me personally, I think option 2 is a good balance. If I had to move really fast to get over onto Web SDK, I would definitely be looking at option 3. But I do worry slightly that option 3 is just putting stuff off, and actually I'm not going to really be learning or understanding or moving in the right direction in terms of using XDM by going down that route. I'm probably storing up problems for tomorrow for a bit of speed today. So that is where my head's at on that. So as I said, option 3 is pretty darn new. There is very little out there. I have actually been talking to a guy who's in the documentation team at Adobe, and they are literally squirreling away, typing as we speak to put some documentation out on it. But Adobe have released a video on this on their official Adobe Analytics YouTube channel. I would make a note of this. I would highly recommend going and having a look at this before you make any decisions about which way you're going to go. There's some really good information in there on that new option. I'm going to leave that on screen for another 5 seconds, just in case people want to make a note of it. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. So finally, how to avoid implementation banana peels. So there were a number of things that we sort of hit upon and tripped over on our way to Web SDK across the last year. I'm going to share some of those with you today, and hopefully you can then avoid them. So the first one was around that automated click tracking section that I pointed out within the Web SDK. So you may be familiar with something similar in Adobe Analytics, the automatic download and exit link tracking that it does. And on the face of it, these two sections look very similar, but they are not equivalent. They are a little bit different, and there are some things you definitely want to be aware of before you go and enable that automated click data collection. So a lot of the things that the sort of quirks can be dealt with through using this callback function that's provided with the automated click data collection. And effectively, what we often want to do is suppress a certain behavior. And the way we can do that is simply by returning false within that callback function. So I've got some examples of that now. So the first one is, you may be thinking that that's when you turn that on, that's going to do exit and download links. It actually tracks every single click. Let me just say it again, every single click that occurs on the site. Every navigation, every expansion, all of that kind of stuff, it is going to send a metrics call. It's going to send a server call back to Adobe. So unless you've got a lot of server calls to use up, or you have a very specific use case where you think that's going to be valuable, you're probably going to want to suppress that behavior. So the way we do that is, again, through entering some code into that callback function. So anything that's not a download link or not an exit link will have a web interaction type of other. So if we return false when that web interaction type is other, it will stop the data from being transmitted. The next one is exit links firing when moving between subdomains. So the example I've given here is you're on www.mysite.com and you navigate to shop.mysite.com. Most of us would probably not want to count that as an exit link, but the code will. The code will see that as an exit link and fire. So again, to suppress that, we can come up with some simple logic. So we can check that web interaction type and check its exit. And if we're on the same domain as we're on, if we're navigating to the same domain that we're on, then we want to return false and prevent that from sending. And finally, exit and download tracking. So this is probably slightly more debatable as to whether you'd want to stop this or not. But effectively, they've made a change to how exit and download tracking works. So you will be used to, with Adobe Analytics, it picking up the URL that you are navigating to or downloading from. What they have changed it to do is to actually pick up the button or link text instead. So you may be happy with that behavior, but you also may want to actually maintain the current behavior of getting the URL for consistency purposes. And Adobe's recommended way of doing that is to set the web interaction name property to undefined. So slightly different to the other ones, we're not returning false. What we're going to do here is we're going to, if it's a download link or it is an exit link, we are going to set that to undefined. And what that does is it effectively deletes the link text from the object, and the fallback behavior of the Web SDK is then to use the URL instead. So that's a way to get the URL in the correct download and exit link reports. Okay, so the next thing that we tripped up over was migrating Adobe Analytics, but not Adobe Target. So you may be tempted to make your lives easier by only doing one of these at a time. So I'll migrate Adobe Analytics and I'll put off doing Adobe Target because that looks a bit hard to do both at once. The problem you have is if you do that is you break the A for T integration, which is not a desirable behavior. Probably you won't want to live with that. So you probably want to move them both at once. Not definitely, but certainly for us, that was a bit of a deal breaker. And now I'm just going to talk about the Get Previous Value plugin. So this one is commonly used to do previous page name, among other things. So with Adobe Analytics, you have these common analytics plugins, and they have a equivalent called Common Web SDK plugins, which is for use with Web SDK. But again, these are not quite the same, certainly in terms of the Get Previous Value plugin. So the cookie that the analytics, Common Analytics plugins sets the cookies for those previous page names against the top level domain, whereas the Common Web SDK plugins actually only sets it against specifically against the subdomains. And this is an issue if you're doing something like previous page name. As people are navigating between subdomains, you will actually lose the previous page name in those transitions. So there isn't any way to config that, it appears, within the extension. So we abandoned the idea of using the Web SDK plugins and instead just built ourselves some logic. So we've just got some stuff in the rules that read and set, and data elements that read and set that cookie that we were previously doing through the Common Analytics plugins. And the final thing to mention is not really something specific, but really something that can occur if something's gone wrong. So at various different points when we've been doing testing and trying to work things out, we have sometimes seen some really weird additional page views turning up in Adobe Analytics. So when we were having problems with all those click tracking stuff, or when we're having some problems with target and things like that, sometimes we'd end up with weird page views turning up in Adobe Analytics. So the symptoms of those weird page views is page views you weren't expecting, but also often the page name values coming through as URLs. And what was happening is it was situations where we hadn't got the XDM object populated correctly, or we hadn't set the interaction type correctly and things like that. And effectively, it's a config error on our side. And what is happening is every time you send something to the edge network, it is pretty much always going to ping that on to Adobe Analytics. And if you haven't got the XDM object set up correctly for Adobe Analytics, Adobe Analytics isn't going to know what to do with it. So if you haven't set, the page name, or it should be a link tracking call, but you haven't put the right things in the XDM object to make it a link tracking call, what happens is Adobe Analytics has some default behaviors. Any unknown hit that's coming into it, it will treat it as a page view. And if you haven't populated page name, it will use the URL field instead. So really just one to watch out for in your testing. And if you're seeing that, that's what's happening. What you need to do is go back and look at the config that you've got set up to make sure that things are correctly populated, and obviously that these things are firing when you want them to fire. So that was really it. That was all the stuff that I wanted to talk about today. So we looked at why we've moved. We looked at some of the key differences. I've done a bit of a demo. We've talked about some of the key challenges that I've faced and some of the common implementation mistakes. We've got about 5 minutes, I think, for some Q&A. So please just go for it. I don't know, Frederick, if you've seen any come in on chat.
Yes, I did. So thank you, first of all. I mean, I do have the audible applause also queued up. So thank you. Thank you for coming on the user group and presenting. So going straight to the first question that we have in chat. I see your hand as well right now, but we're going to treat those first in the chat. So first question is, how does the opt-in functionality work in Web SDK? For example, how to send only analytics for some users, analytics and target for some other users, and analytics target and audience manager, rip in peace, for other users.
Yeah, good question. So first of all, you've got sort of 3 different ways of using the Web SDK. You can be opted in, you can be in a pending status where it will stack metrics calls up, and then if you tell it that you've got consent, it will then fire them. Or you can be fully out, and then it won't do anything until you tell it that it's in. With Web SDK, you can only set up a sort of single permission as it stands today, where you are either in or out on that permission. So what you have to do is you've sort of got that master switch of on or off, and then really everything else you want to be managing through logic. If you're using, for instance, data collection tags, you're going to have to manage that, what's going on, through rules and conditions and so on and so forth. I think Adobe are actually looking at making that a bit more sophisticated, but certainly in today's world, you basically have a master on or off, and then you're going to have to decide whether you're going to include target calls or the such like in what you're doing.
Exactly. So I just shared the link to the documentation as well. Like the shame with that is, of course, that the only real thing you can do today is just switch around your data streams, like configure multiple data streams for all of the different solutions, like enable or not enabled, and then switch those around in real time, which is a little bit of a pain. That's all we have today, at least. So thank you for that answer. There's another question here. So, is there any alternative for activity map in Web SDK? You already covered a lot of that.
So activity map, yeah, what I would say is it does use a lot of that click tracking stuff. So unlike Adobe Analytics, which I think basically, we don't use activity map. So I'll just say that up front. But my understanding is with Adobe Analytics, it sort of captures the clicks on the following subsequent page view. With Web SDK, it is actually using all of those extra clicks that are happening. So there is a bit of a cost implication of that, but you can get at some of the activity map stuff.
Exactly. Thank you for that. So let me see what the next question was. So on the part of the ways to populate the data for the Web SDK, where you showed the 3 options. So someone said that the official documentation recommends using option 3, so using the data object when implementing CJA. Is this still the case if you're migrating to the Web SDK?
So I haven't used CJA, so it's difficult for me to speak to that. I think what we're talking about here in terms of the 3 options is really about how you auto map or map between what is going on client side and the props and evars, etc., that Adobe Analytics is looking to receive. So CJA is going to be able to consume various variables that you're sending through, but specifically, you're going to have to do something to get from the new to the old in terms of Adobe Analytics. So you could potentially be doing 2 different things in that object. You could be doing some stuff in the object which you're intending to use with CJA, and you could be doing some stuff in the object that you're intending to use with Adobe Analytics if you're running those in parallel. Yeah, the main consideration with Adobe Analytics is really how you get from some variable that's set within an object client side and getting that back into a format that Adobe Analytics can consume.
Awesome. All right, so I think looking at the time, because we're right 1 minute before the hour, I think that's where we have to cut it for today. So again, thank you so much, Andrew, for coming on to the user group to share your experiences with the Web SDK. You will also be at the in-person user group that's going to be happening in London in a couple of weeks, 2 weeks at this point, I think. So if people still have questions, would you be cool with them reaching out to you maybe on LinkedIn, like on the Analytics Champions office hours, like those type of events?
Yeah, definitely. And you can also find me on Adobe's Experience League. You can drop me a line there as well. And what I would say also is I'm looking to do another one of these sessions, hopefully in a few weeks' time, on our experiences of using the first-party ID service stuff and getting all that stuff set up. So
amazing.
Look out for that one.
All right, so I think that's then where we can end it for today. Again, thank you so much, Andrew. Thanks everyone in chat and on the call right now for joining. And yeah, see you maybe at an upcoming in-person event or at Andrew's next session in the virtual user group. And have an amazing day.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.